Diane Napoli. I'm the co-chair of the HEF SEPAC with Nate, and I want to give a big thank you to Nate and HEF for organizing this today. Thank you. Oh, great. And the rest of the board is always awesome too. I'm just going to speak for a minute because I know everyone's here to see Dr. Reilly, not me. But I did want to let you know a couple of upcoming events. I want to first thank everybody's support of SEPAC this year has been phenomenal. When we first met over the summer, we all were new. We kind of didn't know what we were doing, and we've just kind of had great help and support, and thank you very much. And as a little token of our thank you, we have a little pizza gathering after with some fruit and cookies, and I hope people can stay and just talk and mingle, and some parents might be coming in, but I think it's mainly for administration, so thank you very much. Just one little couple of things. We do have a fashion show. It'll be an inclusive fashion show called Faces of Beauty on May 19th. We have about 20 girls interested in modeling already. I don't know how, it got out before it got out, but it's really exciting. And I hope everyone can come, and maybe we're going to be asking some people here to model. And just thank you very much for your support. Here's Nate.
All right, well, thanks, Diane. It's great to see familiar faces in the audience. I think a few people might have been to our last event here in this room earlier in the year. For those who have been part of previous events, you know that this year is Year of Friendship for the Hingham SEPAC. And this event tonight wouldn't have been possible without our friends and partners in the Hingham Education Foundation. So I don't know if Alan or Heather are here. I know they're planning to attend the next event, but if they are, give a little wave. They're going to be at the next event, is what I thought. So anyways, they are the financial force behind this event, so thank you to them. With that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker here today. Nadja Reilly is a clinical psychologist with over 15 years of experience specializing in children, adolescents, and families. She completed her graduate training at the University of Miami in Florida and her clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Boston Children's Hospital. Dr. Reilly was a staff psychologist in the Department of Psychiatry at Children's Hospital for 12 years and is currently a consulting psychologist in the department. In addition to being a lecturer of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, Dr. Reilly is the Associate Director of the Freeman Center for Children and Family Development at William James College, as well as the Director of Training for the Center's internship and practicum placements. She is a core faculty member of the Clinical Psychology Doctoral Program and faculty in the Children and Families of Adversity and Resilience concentration. Dr. Reilly is the editor of Preventing Depression, a Toolkit for Schools, co-editor of How Not to Keep... She's on a lot. How Not to Keep a Secret Peer Leadership Curriculum, editor and principal editor of the Break Free from Depression School Curriculum, and executive producer of Break Free from Depression, a documentary focusing on adolescent depression. Dr. Reilly is the author of the book Anxiety and Depression in the Classroom, a teacher's guide to fostering self-regulation in young students. Here's that book, which I think is very directed toward teachers because I've read it. And I think a lot of the folks who are part of the leadership team in the administration, school, and staff have been reading it this year, so a lot of people are familiar with your work. Dr. Reilly has presented at numerous local and national conferences, and we're very excited to have her here with us today. Please join me in welcoming Nadja Reilly to Hingham.
Thank you. I think I need that. Yes, thank you.
All yours.
Thank you. I'm mic'd in two different ways. One's for the camera, one's for you. So, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for inviting me to join you today. I've actually been doing some work on the South Shore for a while now, first in collaboration with Dr. Barbara Green through Youth Health Connections, and most recently I've had the pleasure of going to Duxbury and to Scituate, and I'm really, really excited about having the opportunity to meet with you here because we finally get to talk about social emotional learning. We finally get to talk about the impact of relationships, and we finally get to talk about how to improve relationships in a way that doesn't feel like it has to be driven by a curriculum, but really in a way that's driven more by what you're already doing and by really harnessing that power of your interest and love in working with kids. So thank you for your time today. I have to look way up. So what I'm hoping to do today is give a brief overview of anxiety and depression from a developmental perspective. Then I wanted to talk a little bit approaches that we know are helpful in the context of the classroom of how to manage that. And then finally share with you some sample interventions. Now these interventions are ones that can be used in the classroom, but they can actually be used at home. So I understand there are a couple of parents joining us during this session as well. And so some of these things can actually be translated into home use and classroom use. And one of the things I would encourage you to do is to actually, if you are a parent, think about how could you use this kind of information to communicate with teachers, and think about how to support your student so that whatever language he or she is bringing in from the classroom, you can continue to support at home. One more thing just to let you know, I do have two boys. I have a 14-year-old and an 11-year-old, and I bring that up because I feel like I always come to these events wearing two hats. One is as a clinician, but the other one is as a parent with one son in particular who struggles with a lot of anxiety. And so I've been there sort of from both sides and really, really have come to have such an incredible appreciation of the power that parents and teachers can have together in terms of their relationships. So in terms of what's going on with anxiety, if we take a look at just the rates of mental illness overall, from a worldwide perspective, 1 out of every 4 people across the world will experience some form of mental illness. So we know this is something that's happening globally, and we know that actually it's something that's occurring more and more in kids. So it's important that we not only start to recognize the signs and symptoms early, but that we also intervene early, because what we know is that the earlier we identify and intervene, the better the outcomes. Now for anxiety, anxiety disorders are actually the most common forms of pathology that we see in childhood. And while they typically begin around age 11, we know that some kids, even in preschool, can really struggle with anxiety. Do we have any preschool teachers or early elementary teachers? Are you seeing it already with your little ones? Yeah. So for those kids for whom it's pretty strongly biologically driven, or perhaps for kids that have experienced some significant trauma, we do tend to see these symptoms emerging at earlier ages. Now, gender differences for the little ones tend to be very small, but then we see an increase that occurs for more girls than boys, especially around the time of puberty. And then what happens is that we want to make sure that for those kids that are struggling with one anxiety disorder, that we really do put in place intervention right away, because if not, about 50% of them will develop a secondary anxiety disorder. The other piece that happens is that, especially in early childhood, the mechanisms that drive anxiety and depression tend to co-occur. And so what we want to do is also focus on treating the anxiety, because by doing that, later on we can actually prevent the symptoms of depression from emerging. There are a lot of kids that, if they go untreated, develop symptoms of depression and or substance abuse disorders. And I know I don't need to tell you how critical it's been in terms of substance use difficulties that our youth are experiencing. So anything that we can do early on to kind of manage these symptoms is really trying to do treatment ahead of time, if you will. When it comes to depression, especially in young kids, we know that a family history of depression and exposure to a stressful situation are 2 of the most significant risk factors. And when I say stressful situation, one of the primary ones is a significant loss. So death of a parent is a really big one, but also significant separation. So for example, through divorce or incarceration of one of the parents. Or it can be other loss. So for example, loss of a home, loss of significant friendships. It doesn't have to be necessarily just by death. The other really, really significant stressor that can occur, as you can imagine, is some sort of abuse, be it in the form of neglect, sexual, physical, or emotional abuse. So those are the primary risk factors for very little ones, and the secondary one is biology. So for what we call unipolar depression, which is really just the low symptoms, it can be up to about 66%. Can be accounted by genetics in terms of the development of it. When we talk about bipolar disorder, if one or both parents struggle with bipolar disorder, kids have 5 times greater likelihood of actually developing it. When kids are little, there's actually a very small incidence of depression, although unfortunately we do know that even infants can develop depression, infants and toddlers. But we don't really see that unless we are experiencing pretty extreme conditions. We tend to start seeing it more around 4th grade, start seeing some of the development of the symptoms, and then it really has its increase around middle school. And the average age of onset for that is between 11 and 14 years of age. By about 18 years old, up to 25% though, of our youth will experience some episode of clinical depression. So what that means is there's really a pretty big spike that occurs between middle school and high school. And again, what we know is that the earlier we treat, the better the outcomes. If we have kids that go through an episode that is untreated, then there's a pretty high likelihood, as you can see by these statistics, of relapse. The greater the numbers of clinical episodes that they go through without treatment, the more likelihood that it will become a chronic illness into adulthood. And so again, what we're trying to think about is early intervention and prevention. And so the earlier we get it, then we can really think about improving quality of life later on, but also improving things like academic outcomes, improving relational outcomes. All of those things are really critical. Okay. Now, the symptoms actually show up a little bit differently based on the age range, and so I wanted to share that with you. Preschool age, as I mentioned, if you have a preschooler who's actually struggling with depression, that's pretty severe. And so you are very likely to see a child that's very withdrawn, that has very, very low energy, is having a very hard time with developmental milestones, with growing and flourishing, and certainly with relationships. By school age, you tend to see a presentation that looks almost like you would imagine it's anxiety first, because there's so much co-occurrence with those anxiety symptoms. There can also be a pretty high co-occurrence with disruptive behaviors, so like yelling, acting out, what might look a little bit more like ADHD, or what might look a little bit more like ODD. And so what happens is a lot of these kids tend to initially be misdiagnosed because we think that either, one, it's a learning disability, or it's more of an acting out type of diagnosis. So what I always encourage people to do is, if you see this kind of acting out behavior, always have another lens to say, is this being driven by what we call a more agitated type of depression? Younger adolescents, 10 to 14-year-olds, tend to be pretty clingy in some ways, really nervous. They have a lot of physical symptoms, so a lot of headaches, a lot of stomach aches. I'm sure they present, to the nurse's office quite often. And what happens is that this type of anxiety tends to be really focused on worries of the future. So you hear a lot of, but what if this? But what about that? And what if this doesn't happen? So you start hearing a lot of feeling helplessness, feeling like things happen without their control, and they get very, very nervous around that concept. Then we move on to the older adolescents, and by this point, if the symptoms haven't really been treated, there's an increased sense of hopelessness that surrounds them. So, why am I even going to bother taking care of that? Nothing changes anyway. Or middle school was terrible. Why is high school going to be any different? There's a sense of kind of giving up or not really trusting that interventions will work. And so again, this is another reason why I think if we tend to see this earlier. Younger kids tend to be more willing to accept therapy or to go to treatment. With older kids, it can be sometimes quite a challenge to actually even get them through the door. So one of the things that we're really trying to think about is, from a prevention perspective and from a mental health perspective, how can we start teaching every single child, not just those that are already developing some of these symptoms, the kind of coping skills that will help them, so that even in the event that they do develop some of the symptoms, one, they'll be able to recognize them, they'll be able to tell us what's feeling different because they'll have better self-awareness, and two, they'll be more receptive to the language of emotions and treatment. So that is really ultimately our hope, is that we create a culture where looking at these things, looking at emotional wealth, emotional wealth would be wonderful too, but emotional health and well-being actually are just as important and focused on as academic success. Okay. So to tell you a little bit about the impact across the disorders, I wanted to share with you a bit about what the internal experience of the kids are, because I think this can really help you maybe see behaviors in the classroom a little bit differently, or maybe help understand some interactions a little bit differently. So there's a huge level of shame proneness. What that means is that they feel very shameful of things that happen. And it could be something like, you know, by accident I broke this. Now, if I broke this, I would feel terrible, right? But I wouldn't think that it was because of me, because I'm a bad person, this broke. But what happens is that kids that really struggle with anxiety and depression take on sort of the bad things that happen and make the leap that it's because of me that this is happening. It's because of me that I have no friends. It's because of me that mom is feeling stressed. And so they feel a lot of shame about what's happening. They also feel a lot of shame about their symptoms. So, for example, you might have a 3rd or 4th grader that is feeling really anxious, can't really concentrate, and decides that he's going to rip up a piece of paper, the homework that he was given, he's going to rip it up, he's going to throw it to the ground and say, forget it, I can't do this. I don't want to do this. Now, if you have a child in your classroom that does that, and then that episode is followed by really intense tears and just looking devastated about what happened, it's probably likely that it's driven by either anxiety or depression or a combination. Because usually what happens with kids with externalizing disorder is that they feel very justified in having ripped up that piece of paper. Like, nope, it was your fault you gave me that piece of paper, I didn't want it, I'm going to rip it up. And that sense of responsibility for that isn't as prominent. For kids that really struggle with internalizing disorders, they will worry about what that action just did to the relationship with you. Their worry is that you're not going to like them anymore, or their worry is that they're never going to be able to do well because of these symptoms that they feel they can't control. So it's usually followed by a lot of tears, and a lot of times arguments with parents, arguments with teachers will be followed by this kind of very regretful response. Poor functioning on emotional regulation. So one of the things that I mention in the book is that self-regulation is a really critical component of emotional well-being, right? Think about it. If you can't, not only the piece that has to do with, you know, paying attention, sitting still, being able to focus, that's one part of regulation. The other part of regulation has to do with, if I'm really mad at you, then I'm not going to jump over the desk and do something about that. I'm going to actually think about, well, why am I mad at you? How else could I handle that? And so for kids that really struggle with anxiety and depression, their self-regulation is often impacted by thoughts that won't stop running around in their heads. They're always looking around for a potential threat, and they're really concerned that something will go wrong. Now, imagine trying to focus in the classroom when all of this is going on in your mind. It's going to be really difficult to remember things. It's going to be really difficult to be able to shift attention and learn something new. So it's really important to think about how is the self-regulation that they're having related to emotions impacting their academic functioning, right? And I think often that's the piece that we miss, and when we try to separate academic functioning from emotional functioning, you really can't do that. Because if my brain isn't there and I'm not able to regulate myself internally, I'm not going to be able to take in what's going on from a learning perspective. So kids with anxiety and depression will often focus more on the negative rather than on positive outcomes. So maybe they were struggling a child was struggling in math, and he got a D in the first test, but then got an A in the second test. What do you think will stand out the most? The D. Why do you think the A happened? What will be his interpretation of why the A happened?
It was easy.
He got lucky. It was really easy. He got lucky. All of those things are external to himself, right? And so that self-efficacy, that sense of mastery and control are really lacking. There's also a lot of avoidance. And so avoidance related to, I don't even want to try something that might feel scary, or I don't want to take a risk in doing something. This is something that is consistent from elementary school through high school. Kids that really struggle with anxiety, getting up and doing a presentation in front of class, or having to give a speech or something like that can be really painful. And the reason is, most of the time there's an element that has to do with that social anxiety piece. What are other people going to think of me? What if I make a mistake? What if I don't do this right? What if somebody laughs at me? And so sometimes the resistance you might see in, I'm going under the table, I'm not going to do anything, or no, I don't want to participate in that group, or you might see it a lot in absences. Okay. And then finally, there's a lack of healthy emotional regulation strategies. So I'm sure you've all been in the situation where you have a student when he or she has a big meltdown, right? And you're saying, but what's going on? What's happening? I don't know. Well, I can't help you if you don't tell me what's going on, but I don't know what's going on. Well, how can I help you? I don't know. And so what happens is we try to engage them in that moment around problem solving. And the kids are really stuck in a place where problem solving is not going to be a really helpful solution at the moment, because they're so caught up in that lack of regulation, and they're so caught up in how things are difficult that stopping, making a plan, evaluating solutions is just not going to happen right at that moment, right? So in terms of when kids are having a really hard time, one of the best things to do at that moment is just to help ground them. And one of the best ways to do that is by using your relationship with them. So, you know what, I can tell that you're having a really hard time right now. I just want you to look at me, and I just want you to breathe right now so that your body can be calm and so that you can just listen to me. That's all I need right now, okay? So why don't we take a walk together? Or why don't we just sit over here together? Basically, all you want is to get those executive functions to kind of come back into place, right? At that moment, the kids are functioning from this part of their brain, right? The alarm systems are going off, they're worried that things are going to happen. So you want to calm them down enough so that they could get to this top level thinking. And that's when they'll be able to do some problem solving. Okay. By the way, if there are any questions along the way, I don't want to make you hold on to them until the end. Just let me know if you have questions or if there's anything you want me to clarify. Okay, so we know this, right, from working with kids individually, but we also are getting a lot of research that's giving us the kids' perspective. What is it that kids are feeling or not feeling related to how they are connected or feeling safe in the context of schools? So there was a huge national study that took place of close to 350,000 middle and high school students across the United States. And what they found was that almost 150,000 students, about 50%, felt that they had not developed these really key concepts related to being connected with schools, to teachers, to students. They felt they had not developed social competencies like empathy, decision making, and conflict resolution. So this is what they're perceiving. What that translates into is that only 29% of them felt that their school provided a caring environment. So if you're feeling disconnected, if you're feeling like you don't have those skills, then that leads to things like chronic disengagement. And we know that about 60% of kids indicated that they were chronically disengaged from schools. Now this is a really big problem, because if they're disengaged, how are we going to get their motivation to go up, right? How are we going to convince them that there are really good outcomes that can happen? How are we going to build that internal motivation for them to have that drive to be able to continue to try? Even though they failed, they continue to try. How do we do that if they're chronically disengaged? So that's one piece, right? The other piece then is if we go back to the kids that we have been talking about, those that are struggling with anxiety and depression, they actually are actively, if they're actively rejected by their peers, they report even higher levels of anxiety and depression. So we're dealing with a couple of things. We're dealing with how are the kids connected to us as adults, and how are the kids connected to each other. And to me, that's the foundation of social emotional learning. We have to figure out how to get rid of that chronic disengagement, and that's not going to happen by having a child participate in a curriculum and then that's it, it's taken care of. We actually need to create opportunities for them to feel these social connections and to practice them in a way that they feel safe. Okay, so for us to kind of understand this, right, because sometimes the behaviors can be a little challenging, and I think sometimes it can be hard to say, why can't you just pay attention for a moment? Or why can't you just, we've been doing this for the entire school year. Why are you still having a hard time with this transition? Right? It's hard for us not to think that sometimes. And one of the things that helps me is to kind of reshift my framework in that instead of kids saying to us, I won't, which implies that they're consciously making a choice that they're not going to, it's that they can't, right? So truly, they're having a hard time, and they can't. They're not on purpose saying, I'm not going to do this. They can't say how I feel. I can't make my body stop. I can't make my mind stop. I can't control my feelings, and I can't find other things to do. I'm wondering, when you guys get stressed, who has a hard time shutting their brains off? Right? So what happens? It's like it just won't stop talking to you, right? It just keeps going. Sometimes we feel like we can control that, right? We're like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to worry about that until tomorrow. You know what? I'm just going to watch the show, and I'm going to just let my brain rest. Well, kids that are really actively struggling, particularly with anxiety, can't really do that. That's why we see so many sleep problems associated with it. That's typically why we see so many kids, especially in high school, that they miss a lot of the early classes because they have a hard time. The pattern usually is that they have a hard time falling asleep, then they have a lot of frequent night wakenings, and then it's actually in that early morning period when they can get a little bit more sleep, but then they have to get up. So chronic anxiety and depression can result in pretty significant school attendance problems as well. Okay, so interventions. So what works is a relational framework. So actually, a lot of the treatment that's out there right now for kids that are struggling with anxiety and depression focuses also on relationships. So I think traditionally, treatments used to be very individually focused, right? And they grew out of the tradition of doing individual work with adults, which is, the traditional model of one-to-one therapy. We still do that with kids, but part of what we really need to be able to have is actually that relational piece where they can practice some of these skills with other kids, and where they feel like we're not focusing just on their thoughts, we're also focusing on how to help them make more friends, how to sustain friendships. Actually, all of those things can sometimes be even more important than the work that happens in treatment, because those are the things that will continue to build kids' internal motivation and coping skills. I talked to you about social emotional learning. I'll tell you a little bit more soon about that. Family and community partnerships. So I know that it's not always easy to get in touch with parents, and it might not always be easy to get in touch with teachers. But one of the biggest interventions that we can do is actually have kind of coordinated efforts between home and school to help kids, especially around transitions. And I'll give you my own example. When my son was going into 5th grade, he really had a hard time because he was thinking, oh boy, this is 5th grade. I'm really nervous about it. It's a new year. I really loved my teacher. I don't want to have a new teacher. And so I just went right into the teachers, the 5th grade teacher team, and I said, hi, my son has struggled with anxiety for a really long time. It's really hard for me to come up here and tell you this because I just actually wrote a book about it. But it's my kid I'm dealing with, so it's a different ballgame. And this is what makes him nervous. This is, you know, if he tells you that he has to go to the bathroom, please let him go to the bathroom. His tummy actually really hurts, and when he goes to the bathroom, it really actually helps him feel better. He's not being a pain asking to go to the bathroom, you know, frequently. Please let him do that. Or can you sit him here? And I just went through my strategies, and I said, this is what I think will help, but it's your classroom. You tell me what you think will help, and you tell me what to do at home so I can reinforce that. We had about 3 or 4 conferences, and it went really well. He still had a couple of bumps, but it went really well. And I actually wish that I had done that before, because it would have been progress a lot sooner. So if you're able to kind of share strategies that work at home and implement them in your classroom and vice versa, it can really help in terms of transitioning and just even getting to know the kids that are going to be coming into your classrooms. And then prevention and mental health promotion. So I feel like, a while ago, I used to be the depression lady, because I used to go around to workshops for students to talk to them about depression, and they nicknamed me the depression lady, which is fine with me, but right now I'm liking being the mental health promotion lady. First of all, it's less depressing, but it's also, it really offers up a huge opportunity to be able to think about, what are you doing in your classrooms that you haven't realized is actually social emotional learning? And what are you doing in your classrooms with all your creativity that we can really just turn a focus towards this relationship building with the students for their mental health and wellness? So this is the formal definition of SEL. And if you notice, the focus is on actually helping children and adults developing the skills necessary to effectively manage themselves and their relationships with others. I think that's really meaningful, because it's not saying up there, giving the kids the skills to be able to pass tests. It's actually talking about, how do you manage yourself and others to be able to effectively participate in relationships. However, there's a great bonus, which is that SEL actually helps academic outcomes. So this is really great, because we know that better performance, we have better performance kids. There was this great study that a team from CASEL, I don't know if you're familiar with CASEL, CASEL.org, and it's a fantastic website. I really recommend that you take a look at it. That has been the group that has been the driving force behind social emotional learning. And what they found was that kids that participated in SEL programming in kindergarten and 1st grade actually had much better outcomes years later. So 25 years later, they followed up with them, and they had better educational attainment, they had better relationships, they had, you know, any kind of outcome that you can imagine that you would hope for your kids, they had better outcomes. When it came to academic testing, they actually had 11 percentile points higher in achievement tests. The other piece is that it's not up there, but it's been found that kids that participate in SEL programming and have really good relationships with teachers consistently score higher on reading tests and math tests. So this was the case when it was introduced in 2nd grade, and this effect lasted all the way through into 10th grade. I mean, that's pretty long term and really significant, right? They have improved attitudes and behaviors, including what we've been talking about, which is that internal motivation. So it's not motivation that's like, okay, well, we can, I can buy you a present if you get an A on that test. It's actually, you know what, I really loved how you studied for that test. I noticed that you sat down and you tried and you gave it all you had. And so I am really happy with that B that you got. Good for you. 1 builds external motivation. I'm just doing something for this particular outcome. And by the way, then it's only an A, that's a good outcome. Versus if you focus the internal motivation on the process. And that's a really significant shift that we need to make for the kids. Fewer negative behaviors and reduced emotional distress. So these are all great outcomes of social emotional learning. So in the book, there's a section on each chapter that focuses on notice, nurture, and give. And the reason why I included that in there is because if you remember from the definition of SEL, we as adults also have to be self-aware and participate in changing our own behavior related to how to effectively give kids these skills. So I encourage you to just notice in terms of what factors do you bring in as a teacher, what's your style that impacts the relationships with students? What can you give in terms of skills, supports, and responses? And nurturing. So how to maintain the relational and emotional safety of students. I very purposely included nurture because when we talk about this kind of approach, it's a really long-term approach, right? It's not something that happens within a prescribed amount of time. It's sort of an approach that we're hoping will follow the kids throughout the time that they're with you in the school system. I should also mention, it's not up there, but one of the things that I think is very interesting is that there was also a survey of teachers in terms of what their perceptions were when there were difficult relationships in the classroom. Not surprisingly, what do you think they said? When they were having a hard time with understanding the mental health needs of their kids and relationships felt tough. What do you think they said? Sorry?
Lack of training.
Lack of training, yeah. They felt like lack of training and more training would have been helpful. How did they feel? Huh? Like failures? Inadequate? Demoralized. Yeah. And so what happens is that the group at SEL has also been focusing on teachers and their own development of relationships in terms of professional relationships, mentoring relationships, learning about emotional health and wellness. And actually then what happens is their own outcomes improve, right? So they feel more connected to the buildings, they feel more connected to administrators, and they feel more connected to the students. Okay, so I'm sorry, I tend to be a little corny sometimes. Here's a reflection of that. So TLC, the kids really do need some TLC in terms of teachers loving their kids, looking for connections, and living with compassion. Now, I feel like you know this, but I really want to emphasize how important it is, the impact of your relationship with kids. In some cases, a really strong positive relationship with a teacher can actually serve as a buffer for the negative impact of some negative family situations. I really want to repeat this because I know having worked in schools, and certainly when I have kids and I get very frustrated with families sometimes because change isn't happening, I'm sure that you feel the same way too. Sometimes you're like, ugh, I wish that could change, or I wish I could reach this person. It's important to keep in mind it's not hopeless. So sometimes we can get into the, I think, thinking rut of, well, no matter what we're doing, they're still going to go back into that family and things are still going to be the same. Well, actually, there is a lot that you can do, because if that consistency is there and the kids feel like they have this very secure attachment with you, that can actually buffer some of the negative impact from the other situation. So I really want you to think about that when you find yourself in a bit of a frustrated or hopeless place. The other thing is that in very much the same way that you hear about attachments, right? Babies attached to their moms, and they can go out and explore and they feel safe to do that and they come back. So the same kind of process is happening with you and students. And so those students that feel like they can take risks, like they can go out and try something new, like that they can be who they are and that they're accepted by you and their classmates, actually show better outcomes later on. So I think about, how can we do more collaborative problem solving? How can we integrate more of kids' interests and backgrounds into the learning that's happening in the classroom, right? How can we eliminate a little bit of the competition that might be going on, and how can we foster more of these collaborative relationships? Okay, so this is what I was mentioning to you. Really strong teacher-student relationships, better academic performance, we definitely see it all the way through high school, better social performance, and better school engagement and participation. So I always think about when I was writing the book, actually, somebody was like, oh my gosh, how did you do that? Like, that must have been really hard. And I said, yep, I have to dye my hair a lot more frequently now. It was really hard. But I kept thinking about my 10th grade teacher, actually, my 10th grade English teacher, who kept saying, you know what? Writing sometimes is really hard, but when you love it, you have to keep going. That just stuck with me, right? That just really stuck with me. And I suspect that if you go back and you interview some of your students, they'll remember particular interactions that you had with them that were very meaningful. So again, the research is telling us this. And if we can get them more engaged with school, and if we can get them more engaged with even them feeling successful and empowered, that would be amazing. Okay, so how can we do this? How do you develop these relationships? A lot of messages, both direct and indirect, that emotions matter just as much as academics matter, right? That can be by, what does it feel like when you walk into your classroom? So mentally picture your classroom right now. Is it inviting? Are there messages around how you feel? Are there messages about connecting with others? Do you incorporate into your language when you welcome your students, I'm really happy to see you? Or, you know, I really care about what's going on with you. Let's save, 5 minutes for a check-in so we can just kind of check in and see, take a temperature, how we're feeling. Are those messages something that they hear consistently? Daily opportunities to develop emotional vocabulary. I do this a lot with little ones. Well, I have an 8th grader, so here's how this goes. How you feeling? Fine. How are you? Good. Everything okay? Mm-hmm. So we try to incorporate other ways of figuring out how we're feeling, be it by music or be it by how he's acting. I think in the classroom there should be other opportunities too, right? So sometimes, especially little ones, have a hard time telling you, I feel confused or I feel overwhelmed. Those are emotion words that we have to teach them, but in the meantime, maybe they feel orange today. And that's okay. They'll tell you that they feel orange. You understand what orange is, you're good, because at least they've had a moment to be able to express what's going on. So think visually, think, multimodal learning, same thing for emotions. Establishing emotional safety. So this has a lot to do with what kids feel is safe to bring up. I encourage you to think about, have you ever been in a meeting, for example, where you really wanted to say something, but you felt like, oh, I better not say that because somebody's going to get mad at me, or maybe there might be some repercussions to that. That's having very little emotional safety. And so what happens if a student takes a chance, a risk, and brings something up that might be a little, I don't know, how are you going to handle that so that people can actually take a bit of a risk and still feel safe in the context of the classroom? Broadening the concept of success. So not just grades, not just where people are going to college, not just, what team you're on. Like, oh, are you on the A team? Did you make the A team? I hate those A team and B team things. But really thinking about different ways that one could express success. And then making a commitment to emotional health, as I mentioned. If you are someone that has found really good approaches to doing this, could you perhaps be a mentor to a younger student, a younger teacher that's coming in, a brand new teacher to your building? Could you share some of the strategies that work really well for you with other teachers? A lot of this is actually us tapping into the resources of our own relationships. Okay, so to give you a couple of things that you can do in the classroom, are we doing okay? I'm going to take the temperature. You guys all right? Yeah? Okay. So I'm sure you've heard a big buzz about mindfulness. Yeah? Is everybody like, okay, which program do I use? The whole point about mindfulness is that you want to be able to get kids to move from the bottom part of their brain to the top part of their brain. It's all about self-regulation. So honestly, it doesn't really matter which program you use. It's actually what's important is that they have a chance to practice it, right? And mindfulness doesn't have to be just like sitting there like, right? I don't know a lot of people who could do that. But mindfulness is the practice of just bringing yourself in the moment. So, for example, I'm sure that a lot of times in workshops like these, some of your minds might wonder, like, did I pick up some chicken for dinner tonight, or do I have to stop at the grocery store? Like, right, our mind can go like this and wonder. That's normal because we can bring it back. For kids that are really struggling with self-regulation, their minds are going to be all over the place, but it's going to be in a matter of what's wrong, what's happening here, this is bad, this is not working. And so what you want to do, because they're going to be operating from the bottom part of the brain, you want them to actually be able to still that just long enough that they can get in touch with their bodies and they can get in touch with their thoughts. So one thing I do actually, thinking about mindfulness, is we do body scans. Does anybody do body scans with their kids? No? Okay, so I ask them to pretend that they have like a little wand or whatever, Star Trek type of thing, I don't know, whatever you want to use. But think about that they can scan their body, starting from the top of their heads and going all the way down. And what I want you to do is just notice, are you feeling like restless in any part of your body? Are you feeling uncomfortable? Do you feel any tightness? Do you feel anything in your tummy? And you just work your way down, right? What that does is for a few moments, they're really following you. They're following those instructions. They're becoming a little bit more self-aware, and you're bringing them to be grounded in the moment. You would be surprised what a wonderful thing that does, because it kind of turns a switch from going over here to focusing over here, and now all of a sudden we're back to the top, to executive functions. So mindfulness actually can be something really simple like that. Yes?
So you're talking about practicing mindfulness and some of these other concepts in a time of space when the student is able to hear the information.
Mm-hmm.
How do you then transfer the ability to self-regulate in the moment?
Do you mean when they're having a hard time, or do you mean consistently?
More when they're giving them the ability to use the coping skills in the moment. I find it to be really exquisite training.
Yeah.
Guiding them in the moment, but people aren't always available to do that.
So what you're hoping to do is be a coach initially until they get to the point where they internalize it. So I would encourage doing these things almost like on a routine basis, so it becomes so part of their repertoire that when they're in the middle of a hard situation, they can call it up and it's not something new. You don't want to use this as a new practice in the middle of a hard time because they won't be there, right? You can't learn it in that situation. That's why the thought about mental health promotion is to have everybody learn this and practice it on a daily basis so that when you do have a hard time, you can actually give a verbal prompt to remember it, or you can give a visual cue, but you won't have to train them to do it in the moment. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. Journaling is another piece that's really, really helpful. Journaling can take just a couple of minutes every day. You can do it at the end of the day if you want, together with a check-in in case anybody wants to kind of share what's in their journal. But the purpose behind journaling is for them to develop more self-awareness about what's been going on. And to separate, you'll notice that it says bad self-talk, good self-talk. You want them to start learning how to separate those negative thoughts from positive thoughts because you want to foster those. Kids with anxiety and depression in particular tend to have a lot of negative thoughts about themselves, about others. And I should say it's not just kids with anxiety and depression. If you have some time and you want to practice something, set your alarm to like random times on your phone, and at that time write down what you're thinking about yourself. You will be surprised how absolutely negative we can be in any given moment about ourselves and about what we're thinking. When we can teach kids to tell the difference between negative thinking, like, this is never going to work, I always fail, this is a disaster, why am I even going to try this? And we train them to change that kind of thinking into, you know what, I had a really bad grade, but it's okay, that was just one test, next time I'm going to study differently and I'll do better. There's a very big difference in how one does emotionally with that kind of thinking versus more positive thinking. So what does my stress look like? This is really important. Particularly, I would do it with any age range, but it's really important to do this with middle schoolers. You know how when you respond to stress, some people respond differently, right? So I have a coworker that we have to have a full basket of milk chocolate because she gets stressed out and there's no chocolate. You better run for the hills. There are some people that, you know, they don't eat. Their appetite goes completely away. But sometimes kids don't know what those patterns are, and so what you want to do is start helping them to understand what coping styles they'll use by understanding their triggers. Okay, wait a minute, I'm feeling like I'm really craving chocolate. I must be getting a little stressed. I'm also feeling like I'm snapping at people. I'm going to use this, right? You want to build in that almost like a decision tree for them. In order to do that, they need to know what makes them stressed, including what people make them stressed, how does that affect them, and what have I learned about myself when I get stressed. Again, I encourage you to try this, right? Think about it for yourself. What do you normally do? What have you learned about yourself? If you learn this about yourself, you can probably catch the stress before it gets too out of hand. And then what can I do, right? So we've built self-awareness, we've had them journal about it, we've given them some skills. Here's what we want them to do. You can do this individually. So one of the things I do is I create a little index card and I have them write down kind of what their coping skills are. And then when can you use this? You know, when I'm in school I can use this, when I'm at home I can use this. I would encourage you to do this with your class as a whole, right? So you can ask all of your class, what do you guys do when you get really stressed? What can we do to cope? And have them come up with like maybe the top 5 list or the top 10 list for the classroom. And what you can do is during normally stressful times, maybe before testing, or maybe, when they're getting really wiggly towards the end of the school year, you can say, you know what, I'm looking around and it seems like we just need to take a little break and do one of these things. Which one of these 5 skills are we going to do? And you do it together. That actually really helps in building relationships with kids because they have the same language, and then they can help each other recall what they want to do. Okay. This one is really helpful for the adults too. So thinking about what's productive worry versus what's unproductive worry, right? I'm sure a lot of you have had worries, and sometimes those worries might occupy a lot of your time and attention and your brain power. And so it's really important to think about, is this helpful worry or is this kind of unproductive worry? I see some nodding. Yes, you've had some worries. Okay, I can help you with this. Look. So helpful worry is actually one that's focused on the present and immediate future. Something's going to happen, and you need to do some problem solving to take care of it. Unproductive worry has a unlikely that it might occur, and it might be actually something that you couldn't change anyway. So for example, if a child's parents are going through a divorce, there might be a lot of worry related to it, but it might not be something that the child can change, right? The divorce will happen no matter what. So what I teach kids to do is actually to think about 2 buckets. Is it something I can control? If it is, yes, we're going to do some problem solving. So, did I not study well? Is that something I can control? Yes. I want to try out for a play, but I'm nervous about it. Is that something I can control? Yes. Or is this something I can't control, right? My best friend's moving away. My parents are getting divorced. I have asthma, and sometimes it flares up. When it's not something that you can necessarily change the outcome of it, what you do is you can manage the way that you feel at the moment. And so you use coping skills like journaling, you use coping skills like talking to a friend, you use coping skills like listening to music, things that will help you regulate at the moment. What I like to do is actually have these physical buckets in the classroom, and so you can have an activity where you can have everybody contribute what a potential skill might be for each of those buckets. So if on a particular day you're feeling not too creative and you're not sure what to do, you can go to the bucket and borrow somebody's idea, right? So this helps you have, again, common language. By the way, research shows that kids who can make this distinction between productive versus unproductive worry and actually appropriately switch their coping styles are the ones that have the best outcomes later on, because they're able to be not only aware of the situation but aware of themselves and what they can do. Okay, and this is a really fun thing, and it's for you. So are you familiar with the VIA strengths test? Any of you taken this before? So this is it's available online, it's free, and it actually measures your character strengths, and it gives you an individual profile. It's really easy and quick to take, and I think it's really good for you as teachers to take it because it shows you where your areas of strength are, and you can use that to bring, interesting interventions to the classroom, right? Maybe you come out as someone who has a lot of humor, or maybe you're someone who has a great zest for what you do and for life. So how can you use those strengths and bring them into the classroom? And maybe you can think about using some of these descriptors for kids. If they had these words, how would they describe each other? How would they give these labels to each other? And again, it's free. It's also available for youth, ages 10 to 17. So if you even wanted to take it as a class, you could do that too. And finally, I just wanted to remind you that what you do absolutely makes a difference. And I'm really, really grateful for all of the work that you do every day in the classroom with kids. I know that you don't often get the thank you that you deserve, so thank you very much for all you do. And thank you for your time today. Questions? Yes.
For children struggling with anxiety and depression, how can a teacher have have a relationship with empathy and compassion when we're advised not to hug and not to support them? What would you recommend?
Sure. Well, I think your words can have a lot of meaningful impact, right? So you can let them know that you notice things are different. You can say, I notice something is different. Do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you. I care about how you're feeling. You can also say, thank you for doing this. I noticed that you're doing very well. A lot of those words can actually be just as important as hugs. So the empathy is being able to show that you're noticing, showing that you care, and extending those invitations. I often tell parents and teachers, you might extend that invitation, like I'm here if you want to talk. You might extend it 50 times and get nothing, but then that time when it's needed, they'll come to you because they know you've extended that a lot. So that's a really good way to do it.
What about the kids that are not verbalized? They can't express themselves.
So I would encourage you to try other ways other than just with words. Pictures, this is with the colors. I'm feeling star today, or I think a lot of times visual cues can have really strong impact. So I would try to incorporate that as well. Welcome. Yes.
With a child who presents with frequent outbursts of the anxiety, I'm worried that this is going to happen. I'm worried that this is going to happen. One of the things I've struggled with is how to respond in a way that's the most helpful, whether to be always reassuring, whether to be trying to, I guess I'm curious if you have strategies for that kind of a moment where it's either an outburst or like just a constant draw for that attention in terms of frustration or anxiety.
Sure. So a lot of times kids will, who struggle with anxiety will ask you about things. Well, what about this? What about that? And because we want to make it better, we tend to say, don't worry about it, it's okay. Actually saying don't worry about it makes it worse. So, well, you try it. If you're worried about something, don't worry about it. You're like, what do you mean don't worry about it? So I would say something like, it seems like you're having a really hard time with this right now. Can you tell me how you're feeling that in your body? Can you tell me what thoughts you're having? Because what you're doing is validating the experience. You're not kind of saying, it's fine, don't worry about it. But you're then encouraging the child to take active part in, wait a minute, let me see what it is that I'm getting anxious about. And then you can say, well, what alternatives might we have together? And that's one of the key things. Kids that really have a lot of anxiety will wait for you to tell them what to do. And they'll be reluctant to engage in, well, I think this would be helpful, or coming up with solutions. I would always push for them to say, what do you think we could do? What could we try? And really encourage and reward just even coming up with one solution. Yes?
You discussed how, as a whole group, well, for the little ones, to have coping skills as a whole group. So how do you help them recognize what stress is and anxiety for the kids that don't have that emotional vocabulary?
Sure. So you can do that in various ways depending on the age level. There are some really terrific books for little ones that explain what anxiety is, or what worries are, or what sadness might be. And then you can incorporate that, I think, into your lessons when you're reading a story together and you talk about it. There are definite curricula that talk about how to explain stress or anxiety or depression to kids in middle school and high school. And I actually think it's really helpful to do that, because most of the time when kids are starting to experience symptoms, they don't know what it is. A lot of times they think, especially for teenagers, that they're supposed to feel that way because they're teenagers and they're always told how teenagers are so moody. And so it's helpful for them to understand what's typical versus what's not typical. And you know, I would just create a lesson around that, right? It impacts your brain, it impacts your feelings, your behaviors, your relationships. I think that can be incorporated into science. I think it can be incorporated into, you know, English lessons, all of those things. But I do think it's helpful to give that to them initially, especially so they have the vocabulary, but also a point of determination, so I know where am I falling in this spectrum. Yes?
Seeing as there's such a stigma associated with mental health, do you suggest before introducing words such as anxiety, depression, or maybe you introduce depression, but before introducing words like anxiety or worrisome or things like that, letting the parents know that you'll be introducing that type of vocabulary?
You know, I would do it because I think it's important to build that relationship in the common language. I agree there's still a stigma, and we need to get over it, but I wouldn't do it just because of the stigma. I would do it to actually bring the parents in and say, you know what, we're going to have this conversation, and I would love to hear, like, what words do you use at home maybe to talk about this? Or, you know, I'm letting you know this is how we're going to be discussing it. Can you talk to your kids about it tonight? So that conversation is built in. Also, one thing I would recommend is you can talk about mental health as a whole, and to talk about the fact that sometimes it's like a continuum, and sometimes we're feeling really great and sometimes we're having a harder time, and that way you're talking about taking care of your mental health and wellness, and it's not considered illness, bad, kind of, you know, that it's more strength-based, I think, if you talk about it as just general mental health. And sometimes we feel great, and these are the things we do to continue feeling great, and sometimes when we're not, this is what we do so we feel better. Okay, I'm mindful that I've kept you over your time. Thank you so much. Thank you. You're welcome.
Remind everybody we have pizza.
Oh, yes.
And just a quick reminder for everybody, the SEPAC also wants to thank the teachers for all that you do. Some of our kids do present challenging situations, so the extra effort that's put in it means a ton. We do have pizzas. We were cognizant of the fact that it was a half day for you guys, early release, so we appreciate you being here. And even if it's a matter of taking pizza and going, feeding somebody at home, or eating on the drive, please take pizzas. We have like a ton of them down in the cafeteria. Thank you.